Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to move on to installing the right side cover, engine side cover, which contains the oil pump assembly. Now this might take a couple of videos to complete because there's a fair number of things we have to do here. I'm not really sure. So we'll see as we get into it. All the parts that are eventually going to be installed are laid out here, with the exception over here on the far right we have the banjo bolt gaskets and the oil seals. Excuse me, those are going to be replaced. New parts up here, these are basically gaskets and seals for the banjo bolts. The rest of these parts are all original: oil pump drive gear, banjo bolts, etc. We'll talk about more of these parts in more detail as we move along with the project. And of course, over here on the left we have the oil feed pipes that go between the oil pump and the engine cylinders, as well as the oil feed pipe that comes down from the oil tank that goes to the oil pump. The oil feed lines, that is the white plastic lines, are going to be reused. The black pipe will be replaced. That's a vinyl or rubber type material that will be replaced with new. The side cover itself was painted some months ago. In fact, this is winter of 2020, and this was originally painted probably 6 months ago, and then I top coated the original paint with a matte finish 2K or 2-pack product that is designed to preserve the finish so that things like gasoline and oil will not damage the paint underneath. So that has been top coated. First thing we really need to do is press the new oil seals in, and there are two that are used in this assembly. One will go right here, and that will be for the oil pump drive. This is the oil pump drive right here. And the second will go right here for the kickstart shaft, which comes through from the back side. So those two seals are going to be installed first. Once we got that done, we're going to move on to installing the oil pump itself, the drive gear, and then the oil pump. And eventually we're going to end up mounting this on the engine and then configuring the feed pipes and tying everything up, loose ends up at that point. What I'm going to do in order to put these two oil seals in, I'm going to use my arbor press. I usually don't use an arbor press for this, but I thought just for grins and giggles I'd do something a little different this time. Not sure it's necessary. Usually these two seals go in fairly easily in my experience on other bikes, but we're going to try that anyway. As I indicated, I think earlier, these are the original seals that came out of these two locations. I have new seals that are outside right now in the cold. I've got them sitting in the cold. I had them in the freezer in my house for the last couple of weeks. I just left them outside because it's about 25 degrees Fahrenheit out today, and keep them as cold as possible to shrink them or reduce their size to make it a little bit easier to put them into the side cover. So I'm going to go sit up over at the other bench with the arbor press, and we'll see if we can't get these two oils. Allow me to review a bit what the setup here for this pressing operation is going to look like. I have the platen of the arbor press covered with masking tape, as you can see there, just to protect the side cover. I have a grease here that I'll be using to put a thin film of grease around the edges of the seal before I press it into place. I also have a socket that is just slightly smaller than the hole of this particular seal location right here. That will go between the seal and the ram of the arbor press. I'm going to run outside right now and grab the seal while it's cold, run back in, and I'll press the seal for the kickstart shaft in place first. This is a new Yamaha seal, and I'm going to move quickly here, put a little film of grease along the edges of that seal. Like that. Position the side cover in the seal. Try to get it square. Put the socket in place. I'm just going to lower the ram just enough to put a little tension on it. And then I'm going to finish squaring everything up. Put a little bit more tension on it. I want to get everything centered. And it's just a matter of pressing down like that. And that seal is in place. We're now going to move on to installing the oil pump drive assembly oil seal. This seal will go in the opposite of what is, in terms of the way it's oriented to the side cover, opposite meaning from the way it would typically be placed. So if you look at the position where the oil seal will be pressed into, it often would present itself like this, and that is the outside of the seal, that is where the nomenclature and numbers are, would often get pressed in this orientation here, facing out or facing me as I'm working on it. This is an exception. The seal is actually reversed because this side of the case of the cover is actually the outside. So we're going to push or press this seal in this orientation. Again, a little bit of lubricant, a little bit of grease here around the edge just to ease it in. I don't think I'm going to have any trouble getting this seal in, to be honest with you. I think it's going to go right into place. And we're just going to orient it like so. Take the side cover. There's a socket that's just slightly bigger than the outside radius of the seal, but smaller than the inside of the side cover itself. That will allow me to make sure that I press the seal all the way into place here, taking my time, get that positioned, trying to get it nice and level. And now I have to get it, excuse me, underneath the ram. And we'll just push it into place. Reposition it a little bit. And I think we have got it. It's nice and level all the way around. And it looks like it's, let's see if I can get you a shot of that. And it appears to be down all the way. So we've got both the oil seals in place for the kickstart and the oil pump drive gear. What we're going to move on to next is installing the oil pump drive gear into this cavity. We're back over at the main workspace, and we're going to go ahead now and install the drive gear for the oil pump assembly. These are the various components here that have already been cleaned thoroughly, and I've gone over all of them. Everything's been cleaned for that matter, including my hands, if you notice. You've heard me preach about cleanliness before. Keep everything clean when you're working on these kind of assemblies. Then I have my tools, Loctite, and a little bit of lightweight 3-in-1 oil. Where we're going to begin with this, and this is really a very simple, straightforward assembly process. This drive gear right here with this brass bushing will go into the seal that we put in a few minutes ago. And in order to prepare for that, I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to take my 3-in-1 oil and just put a little bit of a few drops of this lightweight oil, and get it to come out. Lightweight oil on the seal, inside of the seal like that. And I'm going to do that on both sides just to make sure it's well oiled. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bushing. That's on the stepped portion of the bushing. And then that bushing simply fits in like that. And then I'm going to pull the shaft out, make sure that's got a little oil on it, and insert that as well. Now the shaft will go through the seal. This brass bushing here does not. So we'll start it through and just gently work it through like that. Now we're going to assemble the gear to the drive shaft right here. And the way this will fit together is this pin, this drive pin, will go through the hole in the shaft. I'm going to orient the drive gear like you can see there in this direction so that I know approximately which way it's pointing. Then on the drive gear itself, you can see the relief cut in the back of the gear, which is designed to align with that pin. So what I'm going to do, just so that I can keep track of where that is, I'm going to put a mark on the face of the gear there, and there. That's just to give me a sense of where that relief is cut. I'm going to line these marks with that pin and hold the back side so that the drive shaft doesn't drop out, and push it down over the gear like that, and making sure it's engaged. The external tooth lock washer goes on next. There's already indentations that have been cut from when this is assembled originally in the factory, so I'm going to try to make sure that that washer aligns with those previous marks on the plastic. I'm going to put just a drop of Loctite, like you can see there, and then spin down our nut. Making sure everything is still locked together. That's a 14 millimeter. Just snug it up. And there is the drive for the oil pump. I'm going to now mount the oil pump in the side cover before I put the side cover on the bike. And though you can mount the oil pump on the bike once everything's on the bike if you wanted to, this can be just a little bit finicky, so I prefer to do it here at the bench since I can do it that way. And it's generally quite a bit easier, I find, when I do it on the bench. A couple of things about the oil pump. This is the original pump off the bike. It's been thoroughly cleaned inside and out. I have not disassembled the pump. Outside of cleaning, I've done nothing further to it. In my life, I have never encountered an oil pump that's actually failed. I have had oil pumps that have leaked, but I can only say I've never had one fail. I know I've heard stories that other people have, but that has not been my experience. Another little bit unique thing about this pump, this is a Yamaha made pump. Suzuki and Kawasaki, at least to my knowledge and my experience, uses Mikuni made oil pumps. I don't know if in later years Yamaha switched to Mikuni, because I don't claim to be a Yamaha expert, but this is a Yamaha made oil pump. And The bikes that I've worked on over the years, these have been always very reliable. I did have to replace the oil pump on my Yamaha golf cart. There's a video on that. It's an old video by now out there on my channel where I had to pull the oil pump and replace it because it was leaking. And you can in fact buy parts for these, believe it or not, like gaskets and seals and that kind of thing, but I've never taken one apart. But in terms of mounting of the oil pump itself, you'll see I've got the side cover elevated on these 2x4s, and the reason I do that is if you look here, you can see that drive gear just protrudes beyond the edge of the case or the cover, and I don't want to interfere with that, so I just elevate it on a pair of 2x4s, like you can see there. The gasket that goes between the flange of the oil pump here and the side cover down in here is a new one from Yamaha. They're still available. I did already coat both sides of this with anti-seize. Probably can see that. That just makes it easier to get the gasket off in the future if you ever need to. You've heard me talk about that before. The other thing to note on this gasket, it is not symmetrical. And what I mean by that, if you look at the radius on the top here, it's got a larger or a higher radius than it does on the bottom. And that aligns with the mounting boss you can see in there. Is also designed the same way. In other words, this top part right here is taller than the bottom, for lack of other terms. So you want to make sure you orient the gasket correctly. You don't want to reverse it, though it might work that way. That's not the way it's designed. So this has already been all cleaned out, of course. I'm just going to drop the gasket down over like that. I think you can see that. The oil pump itself will mount like this. The spool right here is on the right because the cable that pulls on the spool will come in on the right side. And you can just tell by the way it's mounted that it would fit over like this. One other note on mounting the oil pump in the side cover before you put it on the bike. You want to make sure that you have, on whatever model you're working on, you have access to all the mounting holes for the screws that will mount this to the side of the engine. It could happen that they would put, potentially I suppose, a screw behind the oil pump, and if that's the case, you have to put the pump on after the case is mounted on the engine. In this situation, I have free access to this mounting screw hole, so I don't have to be concerned about that. These two screws over here on the right are the originals that I pulled out of this oil pump. They were in very good condition. I simply cleaned them up. They're not buggered up at all. I cleaned them up and did coat the threads with anti-seize also. First thing I'm going to do to mount this pump is there's a brass bushing down inside there. I think you can just see it. That's where the stem of the drive shaft fits down into. Again, I'm going to take a little light oil. Just happens to be 3-in-1. You could use 2-stroke oil if you're more comfortable with that. And any lightweight oil will be fine. Let's put a little oil in there so that doesn't go in dry. Invert the pump, and we're going to slide it right down over the shaft. And we have to get the gears to mesh just right. I'm turning the gear on the bottom. There, you can feel, you just see that or feel it slip in. It just slipped in right there. Now if you look down in there, you can see how the holes in the mounting flange and the gasket line up pretty well right there. So I'm going to go ahead now, making sure that that nut on the back side is clear so that sits down all the way. I'll just take my screws and get them started. They're just standard 5mm JIS screws. And just snuggles up. I'm not going to torque them. I could look up the torque spec, but it's going to be very low on these 5mm screws. Use common sense and just snug them both up as equally as you can. Nice and firm. So the oil pump drive gear and oil pump is installed, as you can see there. Now this assembly is ready to go on the bike. In order to do that, of course, we'll have a gasket here that I'll have to prepare, and I think I'm going to have to remove the foot peg bar. I didn't realize that when I put the foot peg bar on some time ago now. But that's going to interfere with getting this lower left end over the kickstart shaft. Not a big deal. I think there's only 3 bolts that hold the foot peg bar on, so I don't think I'll have any difficulty getting that off. So a few things I got to prepare, and then we'll mount this cover on the... well, I've changed my mind. I think I'm going to install the oil feed lines from the pump to the engine. That'd be these plastic ones, and the oil pump pipe that comes down from the tank, which is a new piece here. Before I put it on the bike, I looked these pieces over very carefully, and I think it's going to be way too difficult, not impossible, but it's far more difficult than doing it at a bench like I'm going to do here. So I'm going to put the effort at the bench, get all this in place before I take the entire assembly over to the bike and mount it on the side of the engine. Here's the banjo bolts, the original banjo bolts with the little check balls. Obviously everything's been thoroughly cleaned, and the springs, you can just see those right there. Those banjo bolts will go through the ends of the oil feed pipes here and here. The opposite end of these pipes go up to the engine, the cylinders. I did a little preparatory work on the new oil feed pipe that you see here. I clipped off the end at 45 degrees. I've got plenty of length, I think, to work with. And I put a little dielectric grease on here, lubricate it up. And the reason I did that is that oil feed pipe has to pass through this hole in this grommet, which is original, by the way. It's serviceable. I cleaned it up, and I think it'll work okay. I did look for a new one on eBay. I've been watching for one for some time and have not been able to find one, so I'm just going to use or reuse the original. But since this new pipe is a little bit smaller in, or larger in diameter rather than this grommet, I'm anticipating a little trouble getting it up through that smaller hole, so that's why I cut this tip off at 45 degrees to give me a fighting chance to work that through. I also pre-installed the spring. This is the spring off the original feed pipe. This, again, this pipe being a little bit bigger than the original, I had to work it on a little bit. I used dielectric grease on the pipe and had to just kind of twist it on, and it took a few minutes, but I think I have that spring about in the right position, and that can be moved later on if I find it's not correct. I have the new washers for the banjo bolts here to the right. These are new from Yamaha. This part number is still available. These are copper washers. The original washers, and I have a couple of them right here, were fiber, but they are approximately the same size, and they are the right part number. So I'm going to use copper washers with the banjo bolts rather than the original fiber. These plastic feed lines I have not ever taken out of this grommet. They are were left in place. I just cleaned around it. What I'm going to do now is put a little more dielectric grease on this pipe here, and we're going to feed it up. Before I put this assembly in place, I think it'll be easier to do this off the bike or off the side cover than on. So let's just put a little dielectric grease on here, make it a little easier and slippery to go through that fitting. And this fitting fits like this on the side cover. So I got to come up from the back side. And again, remember, I cut that at a 45 to make it a little easier to start, which it went right through. So I'll just pull this down a ways. Not sure how far it's got to go. But on the bike, put a little more dielectric grease on there, I think. And I can always put more on later. Somewhere like that. And these pieces will orient about like that on the side cover. So let's move on to the side cover and see if we can't get these pieces in place. Again, this is going to probably be a little bit fiddly. So bear with me as I work my way through this. I just finished installing the inside banjo bolt washers. Got that all ready to go. That is not snugged up. I'm not going to tighten either one of these banjo fittings up until much later when I've got everything on the bike. I want these lines, these plastic lines, to have a little wiggle room. And I can tell you in retrospect, it would have been a whole lot easier to install that on the pump before I put the pump on the side cover. So lesson learned going forward for any of you. If you have that option, you're going to find that a lot easier. I am also wearing my new headlamp on my forehead that my wife gave me for Christmas. I thought maybe this would help you see a little bit better what I'm doing here. I have all my parts lined up and ready to go. You see the spring right there. On the end inside of the banjo bolt, I have the ball bearing and the two new copper washers. So the ball bearing goes in this hole first. That's just part of the check valve system, so I'm going to just drop that into place. And then I have these two washers. One will go on each side of the banjo fitting, like that, and then on the inside here. I'm going to take just a little dab of grease. What I'm going to be using here is a very, very lightweight. This is actually a grease that I used to use for model railroading. And it's very thin and very lightweight. It's perfect for something like this. And I'm going to spread it on there so that that washer will stay in place, like you can see there. Then I'm going to put in place the spring. I'm going to slip the fitting over the top and then make sure that spring goes down the inside of the banjo. And just finger tighten everything into place. And that one went a whole lot easier than that one on the inside. So again, that's going to be loose so that these lines, these plastic lines, have a little wiggle room. Now we're going to install this hose pipe. This is one of the new clamps that came with the pipe from Yamaha. So you don't want to forget that. Otherwise you're going to have to take it back off. If I can slip that over like that. I'm going to take a little bit of that same grease, put it on the inside of the pipe there to make its transition a little bit easier onto this nipple. And we're just going to push that down all the way. Now I'm checking, just so that you can see what I'm doing here. You can see, I think, get my headlight in there for you, how that's arranged. And that does mimic, I looked at the photos when I originally took this apart, and that mimics virtually identically the way it originally was assembled, orientation of the various pieces. Let me get a needle nose here and see if I can't just work this down a little bit further here. I want that fuel pipe down all the way. Now I can move that pipe back just a little bit. And I think you can see how that all came together. So outside of the fuel, or rather the oil pipe, I've been calling that a fuel pipe, my mistake. Outside of the oil pipe, let me go out here a little broader. Outside of the oil pipe being a little bit larger in diameter than the original here, I think it came together okay. That inside fitting is real hard to get at, as you could expect. And it's going to be hard to tighten up because I'm going to have to get a little tiny wrench in there eventually to snug that up when the time comes. This one will be easy to do. I think that's going to be it for this part of it. We're going to end up moving over to the bike now, and we'll install this entire assembly on the right side of the engine. That's going to be it for this video right now, folks. Any issues, questions, comments, drop me a note. Otherwise, thanks for watching.